Hey, everybody, welcome back. My name's Chris Wagner. We're here with Marcus Radu. Marcus, how the heck you doing today?
Doing great, Chris. Happy to be back.
Awesome. Last time you gave us an overview of what a fabric pipeline is. That was really cool. That really helped me understand how we'd use a pipeline. But today I was kind of hoping we could go into like how we could use a pipeline to copy data from one place to another. Is that something we could do?
We sure can. Let's head over to my machine.
Awesome.
So as Chris mentioned in our first video of this pipeline series, we talked about how to set up a pipeline and some of the basic menu options and ribbon options that you have in the pipeline UI. Today, we're going to show you how to copy data. And in the example we're going to show, we're going to take data from a blob storage account in Azure, and we're going to move it into our existing lakehouse within Fabric. So on my screen here, I have an existing pipeline that we set up in that first video. Again, I like to use some consistent naming convention in that pipeline. So PL for pipeline, data, because this is going to be a data oriented or focused pipeline where I'm moving data there. We talked about last time how pipelines can have a couple different focuses such as orchestration or data movement. This pipeline is going to be focused on moving data from one resource to the next or one environment to the next. We're going to be copying data from a blob storage account, and we're going to be dropping it right into our lakehouse.
Okay.
So the first thing I'm going to do here on the pipeline screen is I'm going to select Add Pipeline Activity. And underneath the Move and Transform, I'm going to select Copy Data. Just move this to the center of the screen. A couple things I'm going to do here on this first General tab. First off, I'm going to give it a better name instead of just Copy Data 1. I'm going to mirror that pipeline name almost, and I'm going to say Copy Blob to Lakehouse or LH. A couple other options here on General just to keep in mind. A best practice is to potentially adjust the timeout period. So the default that Microsoft sets on this is 12 hours. Now, I don't know about you, but if something goes wrong in my pipeline, I don't necessarily want it spinning or running for 12 hours at a time, sucking up potentially valuable resources in my Fabric SKU. So I'm gonna, as a best practice here, I'm gonna change this to 1 hour as my timeout period. So just something to keep in mind. Again, if you're just trying something out and you're not leaving the pipeline UI, you're watching it, maybe not something to change right away, but it's just the best practice and a good habit to get into to adjust that timeout period. Underneath that, you have a retry option. So if your pipeline fails, you can say you want to have it retry X number of times. So again, I could change that to 2, I could change that to 5, whatever you feel is appropriate for the number of retries there, you can set that. I'm going to just leave that at the default of 0.
I recommend a best practice of 3. I have some extensive studies and analysis on top of that. Below 3, you can miss out on successful reruns. Above 3, you're just rerunning things that are going to fail and you're wasting time to get to like an alerting mechanism. So 3 is my absolute favorite on that.
We'll go with that recommendation. Thank you for that, Chris. We'll set it to 3. And then for the retry interval, this again is how much time in between those retries that you have. So it is in second increments. So the default is 30. Again, you can adjust that as you see fit. A couple other options here at the bottom: secure output, secure input. So by default, these are unchecked. And if I hover over the information icon here, when checked, output from the activity will not be captured in logging. So if you do not want your logging results captured by Microsoft, you can check these boxes to encrypt that and make sure that that does not get sent to that. Now, in my opinion, those are very niche use cases on where you may want those logging results locked down. The logging that is provided in Azure Data Factory can be very helpful in debugging and keeping an audit history of those pipelines runs and being able to go back and see in potentially a separate table or file that you have to keep those logging results in.
Yeah, I think that the best practice is you use those two runs anytime you're working with PHI or PII data. Those are the places where I've seen people use that secure input and secure output.
Absolutely. So now that we have our general tab set, we're going to move to our source. So in this case, I'm going to pick a external source. Before we set those settings, one thing I do want to call out is Microsoft has baked in some sample data sets to get you started. So if you don't have any data and you just want to test out pipeline functionality in Fabric, you can click on sample data set here and select browse. And Microsoft has embedded 5 sample data sets here for you to get started with if you don't have a starting point of data and you're just doing some functionality testing in pipelines. So pretty cool to see that that's already teed up for you again as a starting point if you don't have any sample data to work with.
Wow, that's incredible.
So I'm going to go back to the external pick here and I'm going to create a new connection. So I'm going to click on the plus icon, do new, and select Azure Blob Storage as my connection. You can see there's a number of connectors available. Looks very similar to the Power Query Online experience, Chris, that's available.
Right, this is something I'm very familiar with.
So I'm going to go ahead and create a new connection. And I'm going to call it sample data. And hit create. Nope, had that in the wrong spot here.
Strike that, reverse it, right?
Exactly. Okay, let's do create here. All right, now that I have my connection to my source data set, I'm now going to configure the file path. So since this is a blob storage, I do need to set the file path that this is going to go and get the files from. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to fill in the file path and directory. And since we're getting multiple files from this blob storage, I'm not going to set the file name. I'm going to leave that open. So what I'm saying here is I'm going to get every file that's been defined in this file path. You do have a couple of different options within here that they give you for file path type. You could do a wildcard file path. So if you have a number of similarly named files, you could use a wildcard, which would be this asterisk symbol here that you could plug in if you were to select wildcard path, and then maybe put an extension here such as CSV or Parquet as an example to loop through a wildcard path of files. But again, I'm going to leave it at file path. I'm going to leave this recursively option checked. So this is going to say that it is going to loop through the file path that I've defined and grab every file in that file path.
Okay.
File format I'm going to leave as binary, but you can see here, if I hit the drop down, there are a number of different supported file types for blob storage, depending on how you have your data stored.
Why would you choose binary?
In this case, this is just the way that the data is stored in the blob storage. Yep. So it really just depends on the format of the data that you're pulling from and the extension of the files that they are saved in that resource.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then you do have a couple of options here to do some filtering. So if you have the files maybe saved by timestamp, or you only want to pull a certain section of files based on a timestamp, you can specify that with a start and end time. And then the last two here, delete files after completion. So that could be a use case, potentially to delete the files after you've copied them over. In this case, we don't want to do that, so we're going to leave that unchecked. And then max concurrent connections, you can explicitly set that here. The default is to let Fabric pipelines control how many concurrent connections are going on at once. As we go here, you'll see that there are a couple of other properties to set that you can explicitly set for Fabric pipelines. Typically, you want to leave those types of properties up to Fabric pipelines to decide dynamically what is the best use of resources and set of connections or parallelism that you may want to set in your pipeline, and let the resource decide, except unless you have a specific use case that you want to define for that. So we're going to leave that blank. Next, we need to define our destination. So in this case, we want to take that blob storage data and put it into our lakehouse. So our data store type is going to be a workspace, which we have in Fabric here. We're going to select Lakehouse as our data store type. You can see if I hit the drop down, you have those other Fabric resources such as KQL database or data warehouse. And then for my Lakehouse, I'm going to select the BT demo Lakehouse that we have.
Okay. So this is the lakehouse that we've been working on and that we've created. We're just going to be moving this data into it, right? This will be like moving data into like the raw layer or the bronze layer, right?
Correct. So since we're pulling files and not tables from our blob storage, we're going to select the files option, and we're going to type in our directory name that we want to land the files in our lakehouse in. So in this case, I'm going to do WWI, since it is Wild World Importer sample data, and just do raw to specify, Chris, just like you mentioned, that this is raw data coming in. I'm going to leave it as file format binary for how I'm landing that. And then underneath the advanced options here, if you're dealing with JSON data, it does give you a couple of options here to automatically flatten the hierarchy in that or preserve the hierarchy. So those would be options to consider if you're dealing with JSON formatted files. And again, you have a couple of additional options here for concurrent connections and block size that you are able to set or leave blank as the default.
Okay, so those are things that, like, me as a typical starting user, I wouldn't need to get into it. But if it started to get to the point where I need to really optimize my load, those would be the types of switches or levers I could pull in order to help my load process. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. As starting out, if you don't know what those mean, you don't necessarily need to adjust those. Leaving them as the default will be just fine. If you're getting into a little bit more advanced configuration and you understand what changing those is going to do, those would be things to consider setting before running your pipeline.
Fantastic.
Again, going to the last option here, the settings, just going off our last point, these are things you can leave as the default. You can see the logging options at the bottom again. Fault tolerance, you can skip missing files, skip forbidden files, skip files with invalid names. The default here is skip missing files. This degree of copy parallelism, you can explicitly set, but again, recommend leaving that blank because then that leaves it up to the Fabric pipeline resource to determine how much parallelism it is using. It can dynamically read that based on, or dynamically determine that based on the source data that it's pulling in. And then the throughput optimization, if we hover over the information icon there, again, if you leave it at auto, which is the default, the setting is dynamically applied based on your source destination pair and data pattern. So leaving it as the default, again, leaves it up to the Fabric pipeline to determine what is the best allocation of resources there for that option.
Sure. Well, and I think I know Microsoft's working on like AIs to like automate all these processes, because they want everyone to have a good experience working here, right? So allowing those things to automate will, I think it's going to yield results, if not now, in the future.
Totally. The less settings that I need to be worried about as a end user or a developer, the better, because then I can focus on more of the meaningful work of actually getting that data landed and transformed in my data architecture.
Agreed.
So what do you say, Chris? Should we fire this off and see
Yeah,
a
let's see
pipeline
how
run?
it goes.
All right.
Fingers crossed.
Before we do that, sorry, one more thing I want to point out is in the home ribbon here or in the run ribbon, there is a validate button. By clicking that, what this does is the validate checks to see if you have any errors in your pipeline before running it. So there may be more obvious errors that you as the user can see. There may be some that might be hidden away or tough to determine if you have those in your pipeline. Selecting validate just ensures that you don't have any errors before you start that pipeline run. So you can see I clicked that, mine's been validated, no errors were found. So we're ready to go here.
Awesome.
Okay, so now that we have our pipeline set and it's validated, we're going to hit run. And you can see here in the menu down below, there's an output window. And if I hit refresh, we can monitor the activities that are going on in our pipeline. So you can see right now our single activity of copy blob to Lakehouse is in progress. If I click the arrow, the right pointing arrow here, you can see the source information that's going into my pipeline. So the settings that I had, the source data, the destination, excuse me. And if I click the glasses here, oh, that's good. It succeeded.
There we go.
So I'll click this second arrow. This shows you a summary of, things like files read, files written, connections, parallel copies. So all those settings we just covered, for the most part, are captured here in a JSON output for the pipeline.
Got
And then
it.
if I click the glasses icon here and pull open additional auditing information about that pipeline run. So Really nice way to debug your pipeline, see exactly how much data was moved between source and destination. In this case, how many files were read and written. We can see that all matches. We have our succeeded status and some other metadata that was captured throughout the pipeline run.
Awesome, man. This is fantastic. So now, this is a great way to move data from one blob container to another.
Absolutely. And just to confirm that we landed our data, I'm going to go over to our Lakehouse view here. And sure enough, we can see in our files section, we now have a full list of files that was copied into our Lakehouse. So we can see that it worked.
Oh, and okay, so I've loaded the stuff in. Can I then use my pipeline to possibly run a notebook?
You can, Chris, and come back for the next video to see how we incorporate that step in so that we can take those Lakehouse files, transform those into tables, and then query those directly in our Lakehouse.
Gosh, Marcus, you're always thinking, always one step ahead. So thanks so much. We'll see you next time.